All right, so good morning, everyone. My name is Keith Barrow. I'm the Senior Officer here at Kazan. I would like to welcome you to this webinar, which is Creating Transformative Change, Enacting Epistemic Justice in Nursing Practice Education and Scholarship and Research. This is part two of a four-part series, with today focusing on integrating epistemic justice across curricula and pedagogical approaches. Before I jump into more information about today's presentation, I'd like us to take a moment and pay respect to the lands in which we are situated. The Canadian Association of Schools of Nursing respectfully acknowledges that its national office is located on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. CASA would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the Algonquin people who are traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded, and we pay respect to all Indigenous people across this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. For today's webinar, we will begin with a presentation and we'll conclude with time for questions at the end. To submit a question, you can use the Q&A button that is located below your Zoom window. We also encourage you to use the chat function to discuss and share with your fellow participants. I'd like to also note that today's recording will also be recorded and then also posted on YouTube, on Kazan's YouTube channel for future viewing. And with that, I am pleased and honored to have with us today Ashley McEwen, Heather Campbell, and Aisha Hack. Thank you very much to all our speakers for coming together for today's presentation. And with that, I will turn things over to them.
Thanks, Keith. So this is part of a four-part webinar series that we're really looking to support educators, researchers, and institutional leaders with practical strategies for integrating epistemic justice into nursing education, research, institutional practices, scholarship. Today's second session is about integrating epistemic justice across curricula and pedagogical approaches. And so this webinar's focus is really about revising nursing curricula to elevate historically silenced voices, decolonizing our reading lists, and implementing innovative assessments that recognize diverse knowledge production practices. We really hope we can have some discussion around how we as educators can also role model epistemic justice in our teaching methodologies to develop equity-informed course designs. We'd also want to start off by acknowledging the land where we are situated here at Western University. So thank you, Keith, for starting us off in a good way. And last week we did sit with our land acknowledgement and situate our work and recognize that our epistemic justice work is very much informed by decolonial theorists and the works of Indigenous scholars. And today, again, I wanted to acknowledge where we are teaching from here at Western University, from the Arthur Labatt Family School of Nursing, from the Center of Teaching and Learning, from Western Libraries, and that we are located on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape-Wan, and the Connaughton Nations, and with connections also to the Huron-Wendat Nation. And these areas are covered by Treaty 6, London Township Treaty, Treaty 7, Sombra Township Treaty, and Treaty 21 Longwoods. Now, as this is a national webinar, I also wanted to recognize that much of what we now call Canada remains unceded territory, meaning that many Indigenous nations never surrendered or legally signed agreements with the Crown. Systemic racism and colonial violence are embedded in Western academia and nursing education and have led to the silencing and erasure of traditional knowledges, land-based learning and teachings, oral knowledges, and lived experiences as valid ways of knowing. And recently, I've been reflecting a lot on land-based teachings and how I might support nursing students in reconnecting with the land in my teaching practice. These teachings really emphasize relationality, responsibility, reciprocity, and respect. And these are the core values that often underpin Indigenous and diverse ways of knowing. And integrating these pedagogies into nursing curricula is not only an act of reconciliation, but it's a step towards fostering deeper understandings of health as inherently connected to land, connected to culture, and connected to communities. When nursing students are engaging with land-based teachings, they begin to see health beyond a clinical setting, perhaps, as something that is shared by environmental, spiritual, and intergenerational relationships. So today, we hope to share with you some maybe pragmatic and concrete examples of how you can maybe decolonize your individual teaching practice, as well as enact epistemic justice by valuing multiple ways of knowing, especially those historically and currently excluded from academic and healthcare contexts. In nursing, we often talk about lifelong learning being foundational to our practice. And I want to share that I'm still learning and unlearning on how I can do a better job integrating land-based teachings into my nursing educational practice. My goal for everyone in attendance today is to reflect on where we can make really minor changes, even that can create space for lived experiences, land-based knowledges, and indigenous pedagogies. In that we have that these are shared and valuable resources. These are valuable sources of knowledge that inform nursing practice as well. So the goal is really to transform our practice in this manner. And it not only could improve cultural safety in healthcare spaces for the patients that we care for, but also sustain nurses as allies that are committed to equity, to humility, to social justice, and to epistemic justice in our practice. And for those of you who weren't here last week, we also just really wanted to quickly introduce ourselves and position ourselves. So my name's Ashley McHugh, and I'm a lecturer at the Arthur Bat Family School of Nursing. I'm also a cisgendered straight white settler ally with Irish and Scottish ancestry, and I've come to this work with significant privilege. My appearance certainly allows me to navigate space very easily because of the privilege it affords me and the power that I hold because of the way that I look. At the same time, I do hold invisible identities and experiences that have been oppressive challenges for me to navigate. I'm a single mom. I'm a survivor of domestic violence. I'm very neurodivergent, if you get to know me well. And these identities have really also shaped the way that I teach. My work as a nurse and as a nurse educator is largely grounded in the perspective that academia has long privileged Euro-Western colonial ways of knowing. And so I'm still on an unlearning journey, and I'm committed to that unlearning journey in trying to hold multiple truths and see things from multiple worldviews. And this is a lifelong work of mine. I'll let Heather and Aisha introduce themselves as well.
Thanks, Ashley. I'll share a little bit of background of what's brought a librarian here to talk to nurses in a moment. But my name's Heather Campbell. I'm curriculum librarian with Western University. I'm also a curriculum specialist with the Center for Teaching and Learning with my colleague Aisha Huck. I am also, like Ashley, a white cisgender settler to this place. My family originates in Scotland and Ireland. And I'll share a little bit about what's brought me to this work in a moment. But I think in going through an unlearning journey together in partnership with Ashley, it's helped me to better understand myself, to understand my privilege and position within this work, but also my relationship with neurodiversity that I didn't know. And so to demonstrate that this work is fluid and that our relationship with it can change over time is something that I'm personally demonstrating, but also working through as myself. I'll turn it over to Aisha.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here. I'm Aisha Huck, and I come to this work. Oh, it's been a lifelong journey. Those of you who know me know that I sometimes share the story that my earliest memory of schooling was from grade 1 when the teacher asked us to draw ourselves, and I, Canadian Pakistani settler here in Canada, drew myself with blonde hair and blue eyes. And when the teacher asked me why I had done that, I responded and said, because it's more beautiful. And I had a chance to reflect on that experience in schooling as I went on in years. And it wasn't until the fourth year of university that I actually encountered myself, my history in the curriculum, fourth year of university. And so I often say that my experience with education was characterized by an absence, and that absence was me. I was missing from the curriculum, my experiences, any kind of relevance was missing. And that began a lifelong journey of trying to understand how that is and how we can make those experiences different for the students that we encounter in our classes. As somebody in a leadership position now at a university, I also acknowledge the tremendous privilege and responsibility I have now in making those kinds of changes.
Sorry, I turned my mic off because I was coughing. So this is our second webinar in a two-part series. For those of you who missed part one, you can watch the video, and we will do a bit of a review to start off, just to orient everyone. And in our next webinar also is November 13th. So today we're going to do a bit of a review just to orient those that missed the first. Then we want to talk a little bit about decolonial change and transitioning from minor to major reform, because sometimes this work can feel really disempowering, but we want to give you hope. And much of the work today is going to focus on positionality and who you are as an educator, your pedagogy in terms of how you teach as an educator, and then some curriculum related work in that, what do you teach in terms of what's in your reading list? What kind of assessments are you using? What kind of content are you teaching? Everything everything that we have been collecting for you. So last webinar and this webinar, the slides will be available in this hashtag, as well as some really important resources that we're sharing with you over the webinar series. So you're welcome to scan that to have access to these resources.
So a little bit of backstory of what's brought us together in a fast story time that we talked about last time we were gathered is that Western Libraries, of which I'm a member, committed to learning how best to decolonize our curriculum and how we teach and support your students with library research and engaging in research. At the time, I was brand new to Western, and my role is cross-listed to the Center for Teaching and Learning with Aisha, and both units were exploring methodologies for how we might engage in this kind of work. My colleague Dan and I reflected on the process of how we went about that work, the decolonial theories and Indigenous scholars who informed our process, which includes citations to Aisha. Shout out to her. So you can find a link to that article in the chat. But the result was a new library curriculum that has shifted away from traditional approaches of information literacy towards a knowledge justice or epistemic justice approach. And we'll define what that term is if you weren't able to gather with us last time. The learning outcomes themselves are adaptable. They're Creative Commons licensed, and they're in the folder that we've linked as well. That brought me to working with Ashley. We met through Center for Teaching and Learning initiatives and different webinars, and we decided how to explore together how best to teach knowledge justice in the nursing profession. Because even though this was a value that the library had committed to, how best to actually do this work and teach it was something that was new to me and to the library team as well as to Ashley. And so the resulting exploration is what we looked at last time. In webinar one was the result of an open educational resource that we created that demonstrates how you might teach and how your students might acquire knowledge justice values in a 6-part series. And so you can find again the link in our folder. It's again open at Creative Commons licensed, and it's available for you to adapt. There's videos, text, activities, there's a workbook. Again, we'll be able to share, if you didn't get it at the top of the webinar, there's a YouTube video already posted of us going through this resource from webinar one. But what does it talk about? Really, what this resource explores is how might we use a knowledge justice lens to reframe the helping professions that include nursing. How might we reframe evidence-based practice and cultural competency that we expect of your students? And how do we do that through a knowledge justice lens? And so this is based on the principle that every person has the equal capacity to be knowledgeable, but that this right is often denied to individuals based on the social identities that they hold. Knowledge justice involves recognizing that some knowledge systems, particularly those of Indigenous peoples, have been purposefully ignored, silenced, or eliminated. We talked a little bit together at webinar one about how this term Epistemic justice originates from philosophy, and there's a lot of times, particularly, I'll say as a librarian colleague to you, I will say that a lot of nursing scholarship references the work of Miranda Fricker, who's a social philosopher, as well as Dotson in talking about epistemic exclusion. But something that we don't have a ton of time to go into today, but we are happy to talk about anytime, is that this concept of excluding knowledges and that the privileging of white Eurocentric perspectives in curriculum, in research, is a concept that's talked about by many theorists. And so we have resources and references from our first webinar that we invite you to explore. But just a sort of challenge from your librarian friend to you that as you explore the research in your field, know that there are other disciplines, other theorists, particularly Indigenous and decolonial scholars from many different places talking about it in a different term you can see on the screen. And so how do we do this? How are we actionizing this? So this is what we'll be talking about today is in the previous webinar, we looked at how are we teaching students to explore knowledge justice and use that lens in their nursing practice. But how do we do that ourselves as educators and in our course? And so to do that, we need to challenge the dominance of Euro-Western systems and act on our personal responsibilities to engage in meaningful dialogue across multiple and diverse perspectives. So what we'll be practicing today is approaching our own ways of knowing with humility, getting to know who we are, acknowledging the limits or edges of what we understand, not saying that who we are and what we know is wrong, but in looking at how might other perspectives complement and build upon our worldview. In so doing, we can learn to see the world through multiple ways of knowing, and we can approach diverse epistemologies with an open mind instead of teaching about nursing from one perspective. A little bit of backstory. So last time we were together, we talked about our OER and we introduced the concept of knowledge justice. Today is the first of 3 parts that look at creating transformative change. And something that we can credit, Ashley and I can credit Aisha with, is directing us towards the scholarship of the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective, who are a group of international scholars, many of whom are situated in Western Canada, but they're global as well. And they look at how might academia, how might higher education wrestle with these concepts of decolonization and knowledge justice? And a framework that we'll be exploring together starting today and working through parts 4 of this webinar series is the different kinds of change, the different kinds of systems change that is required to really engage in this work in across nursing. And one of those things that they talk about is this idea that there's a spectrum of reform based on where we find ourselves situated. And we'll be talking about a lot as we move forward, but something we wanted to frame today is that there's the change that's required of us at a course level, what we're doing with our syllabi, what we're doing in relationship with individual students is important and essential work. And today we'll be focusing on that and the way that the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures collective, particularly the scholars of Sharon Stein and Vanessa Andriotti, how they define that is this level is of minor reform. And the idea is that these decolonization efforts focus on inclusion and increasing resources at an individual level. So it's changes that we can make in our courses, in professional development, and that kind of thing. Where they challenge us and where parts 3 and 4 will explore is the collective argues that these minor reforms, things that we do within our individual courses are essential, but they don't disrupt all underlying systems and structures. And that is required of us as we move towards major reform and looking at things like policy, research, all tenure and promotion criteria, and program curriculum. And those will be the foci of webinar parts 3 and 4. Where we want to maybe just acknowledge where you are in this spectrum of reform is at the top here is just recognizing that even by coming, you are already engaging in minor reform of your own work and values of your own approach to nursing and nursing education. That there are other areas to explore in their work that might be worth considering of what things might look like decolonization or what are being labeled as decolonization really are just maintaining the status quo. And so it's in enacting some of the things we'll talk about today that will shift us towards minor reform. Aisha, is there anything you wanted to add about that slide? I didn't ask you. Okay, sounds good. I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. So as we start thinking about individual level change or the things that we can action to have an impact in terms of decolonization is the course. And thinking about the course and the course level changes that we can make, I like to think of it as through three different lenses. And I call these lenses positionality, pedagogy, and course content. Or if I were to put it even more simply, they answer three questions. Who am I? How do I teach? And what do I teach? And these are three different levels of impact that we can have in our classrooms. And I want to spend some time today going through each of these three different levels. The first level that I have on the slide here, positionality, is one that you're really familiar with because Heather and Ashley have spent a fair bit of time with you in the last webinar unpacking what this means, how you bring your identity to the classroom. So when I think about positionality in the classroom, I'm really thinking about an instructor, so our own knowledge of our own positionality and our ability to respond to our students' positionalities in the classroom, our ability to anticipate difference in the classroom and be prepared to acknowledge it and embrace that in the classroom. So I'm actually going to ask Ashley, because we chatted about this in the last webinar, to do a little overview of how we had that conversation.
Sure. So yeah, in our last webinar, we introduced chapter 1, which largely focused on power, privilege, and positionality and supporting students to critically reflect on their positionality in relation to their professional nursing practice. And that this was really actually a key prerequisite before we even taught students to learn about epistemic justice and how we might enact that in our professional evidence-based nursing practice. We also talked a lot in our last webinar about the stratification of power and that this was very complex and nuanced. We used an example from academic context that talked about how power could be stratified even within academic institutions and degrees. But it's something we really wanted to highlight in that this is not a binary perspective of the haves and have-nots. It's very complex in terms of how power is shaped in societies and in Canadian societal context specifically. And so as educators also engaging in meaningful epistemic justice work, we too must really meaningfully engage in this positionality work, reflecting critically on all of the social identities in which we hold and positioning ourselves in relation to where we have power and where we are experiencing oppressions and identities, and thinking about what that means in terms of what we are bringing to the classroom in our teaching and our learning and our scholarship practices. So Aisha has some questions, I think, for you to reflect on that.
I could listen to Ashley all day because we always joke that I do the theoretical components, like I help come up with the frameworks, and Ashley is enacting all of this work. So I learn so much every time she's sharing. I want to echo what Ashley is saying about this is not a binary conversation. It's not that we hold power or we don't hold power. There are lots of shades of gray here. And so walking into the classroom, that is one of the first places I think to start. So what are the identities that we hold power in, and in which aspects of our identity do we experience oppressions? Let's talk about safety in the classroom, or a sense of safety in the classroom. How do your identities shape the way that we create those classroom environments that we hope are safer for students? But then also, on the other hand, are there aspects of your identity that make the classroom an unsafe space for you? Perhaps during certain conversations, perhaps during certain moments. What are those conversations and those moments for us? How are our identities shaping our relationship that we build with our students, or even our ability to build relationships with our students, the way that we interact with students, the extent to which we interact with them? Are there any social identities that we feel uncomfortable sharing with students or even with our faculty colleagues or our professional colleagues? This is not wrong, right? So what are those aspects of our identity that we might not be ready to share just yet? Next slide, Heather. To what extent can we be upfront about our social locations and our privileges? Why or why not, right? Are there aspects that we can be upfront about and others that we might not feel comfortable sharing, or maybe not sharing immediately? Maybe those emerge later on as we continue to build trust in the classroom environment. Are there aspects of your identity that you feel impact the way that your students perceive you, may perhaps perceive your authority or your credibility in the classroom? And then, really important to me, how are we encouraging our students to position themselves in relation to the classroom and in relation to the curriculum, to the discipline, right? What backgrounds might students be bringing? What aspects of their identity are they bringing that are impacting their experiences in that environment? And then, in shaping the discipline, how are our identities informing who we view as credible, as knowledgeable sources, as credible sources of information? And then how does that define the way that you establish your curriculum, right? The way that you share with your students, this is what knowledge is, this is what it comes from, and this is what it looks like in the discipline of nursing.
We'd like to give you a chance. Nope.
Oh,
Yeah.
one more.
Your turn
So
first.
in our last session in our discussion around positionality, one of the things that we shared was how much we really liked this flower because it had a petal that reflected the social identity of your preferred way of knowing. And this is because it actually, in doing so, names that scientific and objective ways of thinking and doing are the norm in Canadian healthcare contexts. It names that Euro-Western epistemologies are privileged, and it names that other ways of knowing, being, and doing, like Indigenous and other diverse knowledge systems, are oppressed in Canadian contexts. So it's upfront about it. And in our classrooms, when we're supporting learners to do this, we want them to critically reflect on where they might sit on this flower in terms of their belief systems around epistemologies that align with your personal epistemology. In having this reflection, when we do this with learners, it really supports them in identifying that scientific objectivity can cause, if this is your preferred way of knowing, a certain blindedness to other diverse epistemologies because your worldview has always given you privilege. So it's easy to be blinded to other person's worldviews. Now, as educators, similarly, we really have to critically reflect on where our identity lies here in terms of our preferred ways of knowing and recognize that if our preferred way of knowing is in fact scientific or objective, if that way of thinking feels easier to you because of the way your mind has been baked in terms of our biomedical healthcare delivery system, we in fact might be likely blinded to other missing silenced and dismissed epistemologies. And we are likely excluding those perspectives and ways of knowing from the academic spaces that we create and the teachings that we share with students. Now you can switch your side, Heather.
Now I can talk about activity.
Yeah.
What we wanted to do was give you a chance to practice both stopping and pausing with personal reflection before we go on to thinking about how this might apply to your own teaching and course practices. And so if you weren't with us last time, we used Menti. If you're not familiar with Menti, it's an online polling, and we're going to be using the open text function today. So you can join from the link in the chat, the QR code on your screen, or go to menti.com and you enter the 8-digit code that you can see on the screen or in the chat, 97091376. I'll advance the slide, which has the same information, so it won't be lost, so not to worry. But the question that we'll be asking you to engage with first make sure it works here, is, and it's quite small, so we'll put this in the chat as well, which is whose voices do you privilege in the classroom? And whose voices might you be leaving out? And so if you reflect on your own course outlines, the content you're teaching, the readings you assign, whose voices do you privilege in the classroom? And whose voices might you be leaving out? And you can use Ashley's flower and the different social identities it covers as inspiration. We'll give you a minute here. Okay, so I know you're writing and you're thinking, and I already have to interrupt you, not even interrupt, but just like validate, because there's three of us nodding vigorously at the first two comments of those who are able to, privileged to, welcome to publish in journals. Absolutely. Not all voices are welcome in those spaces. And the second one that we were all nodding vigorously at, which is those who raise their hands and are frequently the same voices again and again. And as somebody who was never that person, I can very much, that validates my experience as well. But I was represented in the curriculum. And so that's something for me to reflect on. What else do we have? Those who can write academically and in English, as whose voices we're privileging. Those who are confident enough to speak precisely. Students we might be leaving out are those who can't come to the classroom, voices who can't afford to be in the university. And that is something we talk about in knowledge justice work a lot, which is that many folks are excluded from higher education for a variety of reasons. And so where is their knowledge represented in our curriculum and approaches? Textbooks, absolutely. And who's welcome there? I'm straight and cis, and so I don't think of SOGI sources. Yep. As an Indigenous nurse scholar, I'm sure I include Black people of color and Indigenous scholars. Historically, they've been excluded or ignored. Even my work is typically ignored. I leave out folks who are not English speaking. Absolutely. And that's all of academia, is so much of we talked about this in the last webinar. I think we did, that we included some slides on the statistics of who's welcome to publish, where are they situated, what languages are they speaking, and so often it's those in the global north and in English. Oh, these are great, folks. Thanks so much. Anglo-Saxon, white Francophone epistemologies, yep, are who's privileged, but I've started to include queer and intersectional epistemologies. And this is something we talk about as well, which is that, like one individual can represent a whole bunch of different intersections. And it's not necessarily about a checklist of diversity, but a range of looking at how do different social identities influence someone's understanding and approach to nursing, certainly. Yeah. See this one. We tend to privilege those who align with our own beliefs. We feel comfort. It's a natural thing of human brains, and it's something we have to purposefully work against, where there's, especially now in the age of echo chambers, etc. These are wonderful. Ashley and Aisha, I didn't know if you wanted to touch on anything else here.
Someone just posted that men are published and cited more, which we also talked about last time too.
Yep.
This is awesome.
Thanks, folks. Feel free to keep looking, and I'll peek back at these results as we go along.
Okay, so building on the responses that you just gave, we want to hear some strategies that you're using when you position yourself in the classroom. And just based on the responses that we received in that Menti, this is clearly a group that has thought about this a lot. And we also want an opportunity to hear from you, to learn from you, and to make sure that all of the participants in the webinar are able to share their experiences and how they engage in these practices in the classroom. So tell us, please, if you can type in the chat, I believe we all can. How do you model self-reflexivity to learners? So do you share how you navigate your own positionality? And if you do, how do you have that conversation? How have you unlearned in your own journey? And do you share pieces of that journey with students? I'm sure you have many difficult conversations in the classroom. How are you engaging in those conversations? What kind of guidelines do you establish? How do you build that sense of a brave space in that classroom so that everybody can have those conversations? So it says, how do you create safety? How do you create those brave spaces in relation to difficult concepts, difficult conversations? But then also at the same time, how do you balance that with allowing students to determine how much disclosure they will have? How do you support those students in setting their own boundaries? So these are big, big questions. Maybe let's take a moment, think about them, and then as you're ready, start typing those in the chat, and we'll raise those. And also tell me if you don't have access to the chat. I'm just going to give it a few more seconds for some responses to trickle in. I hate it when I don't have enough time to think in relation to questions. I want to give us some space. Okay, I'm starting to be intentional, starting to unlearn by being intentional, not only when I'm teaching, but when I'm prepping for lectures and labs. And I would love to hear more about that intentionality. Sharing my own moments of discomfort about unlearning about colonial. Oh, the answers are coming in really, really quickly now. About nursing frameworks and its impacts on current systemic racism in nursing and health. Yeah, absolutely. Acknowledging complexities, making space for diverse dialogue, trying to model not knowing or not having answers. Yes, both so that students feel welcome to share their own knowledge, but also to show these are complex topics that we haven't fully figured out yet. Praxis pauses, integrating praxis pauses in class. So inviting students to reflect on a few questions and write down. Sorry, wait, I lost it. Write down their thoughts, invite their thoughts, and offer my reflections as part of a process of continued learning. I love that idea of a praxis pause. Accountable spaces rather than safe or brave. I like that. Lots of challenges with calling them safe and brave spaces. Modeling and discussing my own journey of unlearning and relearning what was taught to me in my early years and also during formal nursing courses. Oh yeah, my hope is that my own vulnerability, those many times I have failed to see, hear, and value others opens a space for learners to realize that we don't have to be perfect, but we do need to try. Absolutely. One of the first things I tell my students when I engage in these conversations is I acknowledge that this is difficult and that we don't have the answers. And I find that acknowledging at the outset brings the temperature down in the room because they're not expecting one right answer anymore. And yeah, modeling vulnerability, this is so good. Yes, I'm honest that I can't possibly be an expert in everything. Being present without attachment to outcomes. Oh, that's powerful. I won't cold call on you. Thank you, Jessica. The student in me thanks you. Oh, another recommendation for Willie Ermine's work. Speaking about humility as a gift and an opportunity to not know everything. Okay, I love it. I can see themes in some of these comments. That's right, a community agreement. Allowing people to leave the room if they need to. So important to give learners agency, especially when we're having these difficult conversations. Thank you. I'm still thinking about praxis pause.
Those are really good.
Mm-hmm.
I downloaded chat.
Yeah. Can you do that? I didn't know you could.
Yeah, you can do that. Yeah.
I feel like my next example is basically unneeded because we just discussed all of this. But maybe what I will say is we're all here to validate each other that we're doing a good job at our job and doing this work. So one of the examples I was going to give is just role modeling vulnerability. I've had a lot of conversations with colleagues about being vulnerable with students and some of the challenges that brings, certainly surrounding the power dynamics in the classroom. And ultimately, as educators, like letting go of our power and the discomfort of letting go of our power and how that might change the relationship we have with students. When I teach my nursing foundation course, and I do teach several courses, and I don't do this in all of the courses, but the first nursing foundations course that I teach that does have a 3-hour lecture where students critically reflect on their positionality, and knowing that that is coming for them in the course, I actually start my first lecture the first time the students ever meet me with like a 20-minute positioning of myself and a tale of who I am as a human being and my journey in my life. I always cry in front of them in the first 10 minutes of them ever meeting me in a room of 300 people nearly. But I have found that this has really changed my classroom dynamic in the last couple years, where it has created a lot of safety for students, in that they feel more comfortable and able to share their journeys. I am still working on the parts of my shelf that I really feel comfortable to share and not share. One thing I most certainly do is tell them that I am taking risk in talking to you about hard things for me, like my journeys of unlearning. But that's also because I'm asking them to take risks too. And I often tell them almost every lecture, I don't really know what I'm doing, or I'm learning too alongside you. And I think that also creates space for them to ask kind of those questions they might feel uncomfortable asking. But in all of this, I also like to just highlight too that a lot of the work that I do is very much trauma and violence informed in my pedagogical approach. And we have to remember the learners in our classroom. We have to create safety in the classroom and sharing with them. And so a lot of my work is also prefacing if we're going to have hard conversations, even what they're going to be about. So people can choose actually not to participate or get up and leave if they are going to need to do that and that kind of thing. So I think that just summarized what we chatted about in the chat. And Aisha can kind of take us to our next step here in terms of pedagogy.
Thanks so much. So coming back to these 3 lenses, so we've talked about positionality, and you shared really, really thoughtful examples of what this looks like in your classrooms and in your settings. The second lens that I want to look through for a moment, and all of these lenses, by the way, are very interconnected. Sometimes it's impossible to take them apart. I am sort of falsely taking them apart just so that we can have a conversation focused on each of these lenses as a way of entering into these kinds of conversations. But in reality, these are, of course, really, really tied together. Our positionality directly impacts the way that we teach in the classroom. So pedagogy answers that question, how do I teach? What are the things that I do in the classroom? What are the things that I say? What are the things that I expect students to say? And how do I expect students to behave? I spent a lot of years working on a concept called intercultural teaching competence, and wondering and asking the question, and kind of traveling around the world with this question to universities around the world, asking what are the skills that we need in order to teach in diverse settings? What makes that kind of teaching successful? What makes it impactful for students? And based on those responses, we created a framework that incorporates these three lenses. And I learned as I was talking to people and talking to instructors and students around the world is that it comes down to respect. We all want to engage with our students in a way that is respectful to them. Our students want to engage with us in a way that is respectful to us. But you know what? Respect means different things in different contexts. It means different things in different cultures. And so that was a really, really fascinating thing to take away. And it really taught me that we need to make our expectations and our intentions clear. So I really appreciated that comment about intentionality in the chat. So pedagogy is our ability to create that accountable, the term that Zoe was using, an accountable, inclusive learning environment that promotes engagement across difference in the classroom. So how do we do this? Let's look at the next slide. There's many different ways that we can do this, and universal design for learning offers one powerful way of approaching this in the classroom, this idea for designing for everybody. And I was so happy when one of you in your, I think it was in the Mentimeter, more than one person in the Mentimeter actually mentioned participation. We privilege students who raise their hand and speak out loud. And sometimes it's not even just the ability to speak out loud, it's how fast we do it. Right. So those of us, including me, who might need that few moments of reflection time at the very least to think through something very complex, we're not given that opportunity in class because a question is asked and our hands are expected to go up immediately. And if you're not prepared to do it that quickly, then you don't have an opportunity to share your voice. So there's many barriers that students may face in participating. And one of the most fascinating concepts I came across was this idea of silent participation. This idea that we can communicate without actually having to say anything at all. So there's a scholar, Stephen Brookfield, who teaches in the US. He was doing a keynote actually to 500 people, and he challenged us to have a conversation without saying a single word. So he had those big sheets of paper put up across around the room. We gave everyone markers. He posed a question on the board at the front of the room, and he said, I only have one rule for this participation, for this conversation, and it's that you can't speak. And so we had a conversation for 15 minutes in silence. And obviously now we can do this online in really, really easy ways, through Mentimeter and lots of different things. So there's lots of ways that we can share our thoughts with each other without having to always privilege the same way of doing it. The second one is a really important one for me, creating opportunities for peer learning and interaction among diverse learners. There is research time and time again that when we ask students to create groups, they create really homogenous groups. They create groups with the people that they know, with the people who are like them, with the people they are comfortable with. And so unless we do this intentionally, we're not actually encouraging interaction across various dimensions of difference. But here's the second thing. If I just randomly start creating groups, without ever teaching students the skills that they need to be successful in group work, I am actually causing more harm, because now I've put them in difficult group situations and not taught them how to be successful. So there's lots of research that's been done on group work, and one of the things that we learn over and over again is that we don't prepare our students for what this is going to look like. We just create the groups and tell them, sometimes we'll tell them, make a group agreement. But what are the skills that they need to know in order to be successful? Let's break that down for them. Let's teach them those skills before we actually put them into groups. Supporting students during their transition to new cultures and new disciplines. Oh, this is an important one to me. Making expectations really clear to students. And I'm still learning what my expectations are. I have to stop and ask myself all the time, what am I expecting my students to know and be able to do? What background do I assume they're all bringing to the class? A couple of small examples of this. Our disciplines are cultures. So the way that I would make an argument in philosophy is very different than the way I would be expected to defend my argument in a biology class. What counts as evidence in those two disciplines is very different. So if I have a philosophy student in my class, somebody who has maybe taken that route to get to my course, what assumptions might they be bringing about how to build an argument that I'm not aware of? So what are the assumptions that I have to unpack so that I can make this assignment successful for them? And these are just 3 examples of what that could look like. There's many other ways that we could approach this. And actually, I think I asked Ashley to give an example of how she does this.
Yeah, I agree. I could give so many examples. Even when you were saying about giving opportunity for participating in different ways. Often when I teach students about reflecting on their positionality, for example, there's opportunities for people to share in the classroom if they like, but there's also opportunities to engage with reflective writing, and students can choose what they want to do. One of the examples here, I also shared about supporting students in their transition. I've had a lot of reflection on trying to be clear, like Aisha said, in terms of your instructions to undergraduate students, but also trying to be inclusive with the instructions that we're giving to students in terms of assessment. Of late, I've looked at a lot of my rubrics and have that are related to writing assignments, of course. And I have removed all of the language around spelling and grammar. In that, typically the goal of all of my written assignments in my course is not actually to assess students on their quality of spelling and grammar so much as their quality of their ideas, their thought processes, and are they able to locate diverse voices to inform their practice. And so in removing assessments for grammar in rubrics, it really changes the classroom in that, when we're assessing grammar and spelling, this can be quite racist, really, for students that are not speaking English as a first language, and they are not being treated equally compared to other students. Also, I'll point out, as Aisha has really said, that academia uses quite a lot of protective language, and nursing has its like own lexicon, right? So for students that might be first generation learners in academic context too, they don't necessarily have that privilege where they've grown up in a home and they know to use specific types of academic words like discourse and context and the words that we use in academia that would kind of essentially privilege them as for getting better grades. So it's something I've reflected a lot on when assessing students in their written assignments and trying to be supportive in their transition, maybe to Canadian classroom context, but maybe just their transition to academia itself. That's all I have to say about that.
And just a couple of quick things I've done in my classes in the past, because when I started doing this, it was a little bit overwhelming. And one of the big questions I kept coming back to is, well, how will I know what they need? One answer, of course, is UDL and other frameworks that help us think in really broad ways and think of things that we might not have initially. But the most important way is to ask our students. And of course, I had to find ways to do this while still being respectful of things that they might not want to tell me. So I asked them some open-ended questions. What can I do to help you feel comfortable and included in the classroom? And they can tell me whatever they want or nothing, depending on how they want to respond to that. I want to know, what are your professional goals after this program? One of the most powerful things I think we can do as educators is to get midterm feedback on our teaching, and can be done so simply. I ask students at the halfway mark, and sometimes sooner if I feel things are not going as well as they could. I ask them 3 questions. Stop, start, continue. What do you want me to stop doing? What do you want me to start doing? And what do you want me to continue doing? And it's always amazing the things that they share. So I've had everything ranging from the design of my slides, right? Feedback on the design of my slides and how it could improve their ability to take notes. Things that I share with them after class, resources that I could follow up with that they would find helpful. Of course, sometimes they tell me stop starting class at 8:30 in the morning. And I bring all of these back to them, right? Because I want to show that I'm accountable for the change that they've asked me to make. And I bring that back to them, and we can laugh at that one, and I can, let them know this one's beyond my control. So if there's things that I can't do for whatever reason, I will let them know why I can't do that. I think there's a little bit more on this slide, a couple other questions that I found helpful. One is there anything you would like me to know about you as a learner? Really open-ended. I never know how they're going to respond, but they have told me some really, really important things about them and about the way about what will impact their experience in my classroom. And that's been really valuable. Let's move on to course content. And I think this is where it gets a little bit more challenging. So we've saved this one for the end here. These are the changes that we make to the actual curriculum. This is what we're teaching, right? These are all of the perspectives, all of the content, the activities, the assessments that I have thought are important enough that they are going to be a part of this course. So how have I put those together? What does that mean? And how can I begin the process of transforming that? So let's look at the next slide here. There's a couple of ways that we can approach this. And one of the things that I did, because I'm an academic, is I went to the literature. I bracketed my personal experience for a moment. And I'm like, there's such a rich history of tradition when it comes to anti-racist and decolonial pedagogies. What is this literature saying? So I went to literature from South Asia, from across Africa. I looked at literature from Latina literature from the US. I looked at, and then I put that all in the context of Canada settler colonial context, which is really important. So what did those have in common? What were some of the core concepts that kept coming up again and again? So if I were to ask the question, what are some components of a decolonized curriculum? What did the literature have to say? And then to that, I added my own personal experiences, and I continue to add the experiences of other individuals who do this work, and I like to think of this as a bit of a living theory. So at the core of it all, positionality, we've talked about that. Let's move on to the outer parts of this circle. We're going to start with epistemic disobedience. So yes, I am going to ask you to be epistemically disobedient. And what does that mean? What does that look like? Let's look at the next slide. There's a couple of ways of thinking about this. I think there's 2 sort of core components to it. The first is the ability to interrogate the discipline. And I keep using the word discipline in relation to the curriculum because that is what the curriculum is. The curriculum is what I, as the instructor, believe my discipline to be. These are the parts of my discipline that I think are so important that I have to pass them on to my students. So let's look at the discipline. What are the issues with the discipline? And then we need to transform the discipline. So I've got some questions for us under interrogate the discipline. This means that we need to be able to situate the origins of our discipline in its historic and global context. Our disciplines didn't just pop up from nowhere. They have a really complicated relationship with power and specifically with colonization. Most disciplines have some kind of relationship with how the university came to be and how knowledge was created and disseminated through empire, really, really closely linked, right? So what is that relationship? How does my discipline uphold Eurocentrism with the way that it constructs what knowledge is, what counts as knowledge, and how we pass on that knowledge? To what extent does my discipline foreground conversations of gender, sexuality, intersectionality, race, colonization, as they relate to the key concepts that we study in our discipline? So to what extent is that conversation made explicit, or is it not something that we discuss? Next slide. So let's pause here. And I think you've heard a little bit about this in terms of the notion of epistemic injustice that Heather and Ashley have raised in the previous webinar. But I'm curious, if we were to look at our course outcomes, to what extent do they give students an opportunity to consider nursing in its historic, local, and global context? To what extent do our course outcomes foreground gender, sexuality, intersectionality, etc.? To what extent do our outcomes redefine what knowledge is? Do they foreground non-Eurocentric epistemologies and methodologies? So both the way that we create knowledge and the way that we disseminate that knowledge. To what extent do our course outcomes allow students to develop the skills that they will need to engage in the world as socially just citizens? So skills like the ability to navigate difficult conversations or intercultural skills, etc. Let's take a moment, and then if you could pop some thoughts, some comments in the chat, I would love to hear some of the things that you're doing. It's a really big question. I said this is where it gets really hard, and I actually asked Ashley to pull up some examples for us. So keep thinking, and then maybe Ashley can help us jog some thoughts. So maybe if she starts sharing, you'll think of other things that you're already doing.
Sure. Thanks, Aisha. Yeah, so one of the things I always like to be upfront with my students about, especially in my foundations course or courses like global health that I've taught that are grounded in social justice approaches, is that my teaching and style at times in those courses can be really intentionally provocative. And so, for example, in my nursing history lesson, which is part of one of the lectures that I share in a nursing foundations course, I start the lesson off talking about who do we know as a nurse from common pop culture. Most people can answer a Jeopardy question that says Florence Nightingale is the founder of nursing. And essentially, what I do in response to that is make comparisons to Christopher Columbus, right, and the discovery of nursing and what that actually looks like in a Canadian context, and recognizing that healers existed in Canada and on Turtle Island far before settlers arrived here. We talk about white supremacy culture in nursing, and then talk about the voices that have been excluded and are missing from histories of nursing. I talk very much about how nursing history was taught to me, the unlearning that I've had to engage with in trying to teach them about nursing history, and then my visions for the future. Instead of teaching them about the unlearning and teaching them about why things are wrong when we venerate Florence Nightingale as a founder of nursing, and instead of discussing her role in the precursors to residential schools, and how wouldn't it be a different kind of history for me to, instead of having to take a critical lens, be able to just share about the different voices in nursing history that do exist, like Mary Sokol or Edith Montu, not Montu, or Emma Goldman. Another example that I might give from my course in terms of situating the discipline in historical context, and Aisha asked this great question of how does our discipline uphold Eurocentrism? So next slide, Heather. Um, and is about when we're teaching about theorists in nursing, right? So when I was in nursing school, yet again, you learn about Orem, you learn about Peplow, all of these nursing theorists. But what I also encourage my students to do is interrogate who these nursing theorists are and bring that back to some of our positionality work. In that, I typically ask them, these are the faces of all of the nursing theorists. What do you notice about them? And everyone is able to pretty quickly say it's all, older white chicks that have created the foundations of the knowledge of our discipline. And then we have a conversation about what does that mean for the knowledge that our discipline has created if these are the theorists that are deeply informing much of our knowledge construction, whose voices are missing here, and what does that mean for us moving forward if we're needing to more deeply interrogate our knowledge production practices. Another example I might share for those of you that are teaching medical courses, and I often teach a lot of our medical courses too, are just even the way we present visual imagery in our textbooks. Before this webinar, I literally just searched wound care in Google, and this is what showed up. I think this is pretty well known, but much of my life when I teach pathophysiology or any med-surg related nursing courses, I'm very much focused on providing imagery from diverse patient populations. And that also includes ableism in nursing. So we might be beginning to present patients that have diverse skin tones, but in often in healthcare context, we very much don't do a good job also of demonstrating clients with different body types, different body shapes, that type of thing. And that actually really matters, right? If we're talking about supporting, an epidural placement, for example, and what that might look like on different body types. Another example I would share is from pharmacology. So pharmacology, or even in our med-surg clinical courses, when we're talking about non-Euro-Western perspectives of medicine, we call it alternative. And of course, this others, different types of knowledge systems, it shows our Eurocentrism in our curricula. So if you're calling plant-based medicine as alternative medicine, what does that really mean? And what does that signal to our students? So I've gone and I'm continuing to go through quite a lot of self-interrogation in terms of when I was in school and when I became a nurse, and as a nurse, my mind was very much baked into that biomedical model. And I am undergoing a process of interrogation in front of my students on how I might actually be able to teach my students about healthcare from multiple ways of knowing and multiple lenses that are seen more equally in the classroom.
Thanks, Ashley. And we've got some responses in the chat. Zoe has mentioned including weight stigma and fat phobia examples in clinical practice. And I know Ashley, Heather, and I have definitely chatted about that in sessions that we've done before about the importance of that. Andrea has shared a resource of nurses you should know. And these resources are so valuable because this is a lot of unlearning that we're engaging in, and it's hard sometimes to know, well, here's everything that's wrong with my curriculum, but what do I do about that now? What are the next steps? So that's what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the webinar. What are the actual changes that we want to make to the curriculum? This transforming the discipline. What do we do about it? This is a starting list, and as the session continues, we're going to return to that circle diagram and make this richer, because I will say this is a starting point. If we just stopped here, all we're doing is adding. We're just adding diversity to the curriculum. We're not really transforming it fully. So this is how we start, and then we'll dig deeper. So one, coming back to positionality, but to what extent do our students have a chance to gain an understanding of how they relate to the discipline and how their identity is going to interact and intersect with this profession of nursing that they have chosen for themselves? And then to what extent does our curriculum include voices and creators and knowledge holders from equity deserving groups, right? To what extent is that included in the curriculum? Are we making space for non-Eurocentric both epistemologies and methodologies, right? So not just the knowledge that we have in the course, but the way that we teach students to create knowledge of their own. So when we're teaching students, what is a resource? What is a credible resource? What's the language that we're using when we have those conversations? What's the criteria that we're giving them, right? The way that we do this replicates the discipline. I remember once I was engaged in a conversation at my institution about transforming the dissertation, right? And transforming what it is to have a PhD. And when I asked a panel of graduate chairs the question, what is the purpose of the comprehensive exam? Many of them responded to say that the purpose of the comprehensive exam is to reproduce the discipline. And that is not what we're talking about here. We're not seeking to simply reproduce the discipline in our curriculum. We're really questioning and we're really seeking to change what that discipline is in terms of who gets to make choices about what knowledge is included and not included. I've mentioned interdisciplinary approaches here because a lot of decolonial scholars actually see interdisciplinarity as an antidote to colonial approaches to education. When universities were formed, disciplines were formed with it. And so disciplines at their root are a pretty colonial imperial concept. And so the ability to think across disciplines is considered really powerful in the scholarship of decolonizing the curriculum. Next slide. So what are some ways we can do this? And I've had the opportunity to talk to a lot of students as well about when people include this kind of thing on the curriculum, what are your thoughts about it? And one of the most interesting responses I ever received from students and student partners is, oh, you mean diversity week? And I said, what do you mean by that? And they said, oh, that's when the instructor has a week at the end of the term about like other things. And so it might include other ways of thinking, other ways of doing research, but it's all sort of at the end of the term. And as they put it to me, they said, we've stopped caring about the course by then. The last week doesn't really count, is what they said. So it was really fascinating to get their perspective on where this stuff comes in the curriculum and what that placement tells them, the message that it sends to them. So the message that they were getting is this stuff isn't important and it's kind of tacked on to the end of the course. So to what extent do our course readings center historically underrepresented, marginalized, and equity deserving scholars and or perspectives in our field. When normative texts are discussed, right, so the core concepts of our discipline, do students have an opportunity to read them against the grain? And that's my disciplinary way of saying, do students have an ability to interrogate them, to resist them, to disagree with those things, to essentially consider that knowledge in its local historic context? Is diversity, does that appear throughout the course reading list? Or is it just isolated to 1 or 2 readings? And then do those 1 or 2 readings occur at the end of the term? We have an active chat happening. Ooh, I find that the concept of professionalism is a colonial approach to shape what nurses look or act like. Oh, this is a concept I find myself interrogating in my own pedagogies. That's a really, that's a powerful comment.
Hmm. I feel like it's really connected to the example that I'm going to share too. Uh,
Go
in
ahead, Ashley.
Yeah, so one of the things that I've really had a reflection on a lot is how we articulate what leadership looks like in nursing and in professional practice. I've shared a book here written by my colleague. It's their thesis dissertation on Indigenous women's experiences in Canadian university administration. But the book articulates largely perspectives of Indigenous leadership and being relational, being maternal. So it was a really eye-opening read for myself in terms of having me interrogate my perspective of what makes a good leader and leadership. Um, in fact, it was kind of validating because my ways of being might actually be more relational, and I have never seen myself as a person that could and would be a leader. Because I have learned about Euro-Western perspectives of leadership, that this is somebody that is assertive and makes decisions, right? So now when I am articulating that in my nursing practices about our course about leadership, I also am having students interrogate even the tools that I have them reflect on their leadership style and then interrogate the tool for like, well, who says that that means that you're a leader? So I agree with the comment about professionalism too, because similarly, when we start to have discussions around professionalism, I do the same thing. And this has been a journey for me and wasn't something I did immediately as I leaned into this epistemic justice work. It's something that I've been slowly changing every lesson over the last couple of years in all of the courses that I teach. And again, it just goes back to we're unlearning, right? The way that we were taught what leadership was in nursing versus what leadership could look like and how that could actually be quite healing for our profession. And so I encourage you to continue to also critically reflect on how you're integrating these non-Eurocentric epistemologies into your lessons. The other example I wanted to share was doing this beyond a single course. So some of you have the privilege of teaching maybe 7 or 8 theory courses a year, like me at my institution at times. And that means also that we can create broader change. One of the beautiful things I have access to at my school is sharing our gifts, which is Indigenous-led, Indigenous-developed curriculum that can be integrated in any institution at Western University. This is from Carleton. They have kind of led this model, and other academic institutions do have these types of resources. So across the program, I have also supported other faculty and in courses that I teach myself in integrating some of these learning bundles or learning modules that represent a 3-hour lecture that are taught from Indigenous elders, Indigenous scholars about these concepts, and then support students in connecting them to nursing practice. In foundations courses, we talk about Indigenous knowledges. In global health, we discuss about Indigenous and Black solidarities. In social justice, we have a module about Indigenous women and resilience. In informatics, we're working to integrate Indigenous storytelling and media representation, and as well as in our 4th year leadership course about Indigenous leadership. So this is something you can think about also across program structures.
Thanks, Ashley. And that's a really important example, I think, because it's a way of embedding Indigenous methodologies and epistemologies into our curricula in a way that is ethical, right? Because those bundles that we have access to here at Western are led by Indigenous scholars. They're created by Indigenous scholars, and they are embedded into courses with the support of Indigenous scholars. So that is a really critical component to ensuring that we take that ethical approach. So how do we keep diving deeper into the sense of what a decolonized curriculum is and what it includes? And the second component that I want to highlight here that I was really fascinated by is this idea of epistemic uncertainty. What is that? Next slide. Okay, this is one of my favorite concepts. Epistemic uncertainty is getting to know the problem, and it's listening before acting. We have a sense, I find often in Western academia, that speed and efficiency they come before everything else. And when a problem is identified, we rush to solve the problem. And we are timelines are imposed on us on how quickly we can do this and how efficiently we can do this. And I kept coming back to this notion that that is very antithetical to our goal here, because it's taken us centuries to get into this mess that we are in. The idea that we can so quickly understand it and recover from it and move on successfully is harmful, I think. So epistemic uncertainty is one of the things that comes up in the literature time and time again. It's sustained reflection and slow thinking. And I love that. It's something that we don't often get an opportunity to do. It means sitting with the discomfort. It's a willingness to act without guarantees. And that is also so important. How often are we given license to experiment and to act without knowing for certain that our action is going to be successful? Next slide. Oh, instead of decolonizing, is it really not just re-indigenization? Can you say more about that? I think I know where you're going with that. Epistemic uncertainty has the potential to disrupt cognitive manifestations of privilege. So we have spent years becoming experts in our disciplines. We have done this so well. We've marinated in these ideas for so long and done it so well that we've been granted advanced degrees in these topics. So we've done this very successfully, and now we have to unlearn it. And now we have to sit with this idea that we're not always going to know the answer. And that's one of the reasons I was so drawn to the comments in the chat, where you were talking about vulnerability earlier, and you tell your students that you don't always have the right answer. That's exactly what the spirit of epistemic uncertainty is taking us. Next slide. One of the ways of looking at this, and one of the ways that it's referred to in the literature, is tolerance for ambiguity as sort of the skill or the principle that we're trying to practice. And so what opportunities do we have to practice this in our curriculum, to encounter this and practice it? So it's recognizing and acknowledging that there are multiple perspectives on and interpretations of any given situation or issue. It's not just one answer. And depending on what discipline we've been marinating in, this is a tough one to digest. Recognizing and acknowledging that one's own perspective on a situation might be no better than other people's perspectives. There's just many different perspectives, and there's no moral weight to which perspective. It's accepting complexity. It's accepting contradictions, and it's accepting lack of clarity. It's a willingness to undertake tasks when only incomplete or partial information is available. And it's a willingness to tolerate uncertainty and to deal with it constructively. So what are some examples of what this could look like in the curriculum? Ashley. So one way of thinking about this is, do students have multiple ways of demonstrating knowledge? Written assignments, oral presentations, visual work, experiential, independent work, reflections, group work. And I'm hoping we can keep that chat going. Ashley's going to share some of her examples, and I'd love to see some of your examples in the chat as well.
You're muted, Ashley.
So, sorry, I was coughing and I didn't want everyone to listen to me cough. So one of the examples that Aisha had shared earlier was speaking to UDL, or Universal Design for Learning principles, and very much so providing students with multiple means of engagement also really aligns with this work in terms of allowing students to demonstrate that they hold knowledge in different forms and that they can choose to engage in demonstrating their knowledge in those different forms. One of the ways I've done this in one of the courses that I teach related to obstetrics is over the course, I allowed the students to choose one of 4 assignment types. One of the assignments was a virtual visit with a public health nurse where they just recorded themselves interviewing somebody else for 10 minutes about a reason why they had come to see a public health nurse, and they submitted this in an MP4. Another option was for students to submit a reflection on trauma and violence informed care, where they were given a scenario after watching videos that were embedded throughout the course, where I had interviewed people about their lived experience of various traumatic engagement that they had had with healthcare systems in these care areas. So, for example, I interviewed somebody that experienced an early pregnancy loss, somebody that both of their children were born with gastrocesis. I interviewed somebody who actually palliated their 3-week-old baby at home. And now the students were in this place that they were caring for these individuals in the future. And we were talking, they were asked to reflect on how they would provide trauma and violence informed care. Even in this assignment, the reflection could be submitted as a written reflection, or also could have been submitted as an audio file if that's what they preferred. For students who really were wanting to do the clinical stuff, there was also options to video record themselves on how to do a head to toe on a person that was an antenatal patient or a newborn. And I said they can use a teddy bear if they wanted. They just were walking through the skill kind of thing. And then I also had students that were really wanting to create imagery through concept maps where they were giving case studies and answering them. And what I will really highlight here is not only were there 4 different assignment types where students could demonstrate their knowledge in various forms, also within every single assignment type, there was around 6 case studies that included people from all sorts of places in this world and how students could support them. We had content that was case studies on trans abortion care, for example, and many different opportunities for students to engage in learning and unlearning themselves across all of these assignments. So this was just one way in terms of showing students that I believed that they held knowledge in many different forms, and I wanted to value that knowledge in many of those different forms. Another example that I would share is, and this is something that I think is harder to kind of make that jump for some of the traditionally bench science courses that we have in nursing, is my pathophysiology course in nursing. In this course, I have the option to engage with an aesthetic expression assignment where the students are actually given a couple of options where they can read a poem about somebody's lived experience with having a hysterectomy, or another example is maybe artwork that someone had painted related to Crohn's disease. And then they also can basically choose any patient experience of their choice, as well as talk about their own, where they're engaging with art and then creating art and writing a reflection or recording themselves orally about creating this art piece in relation to looking at art as knowledge in healthcare in a pathophysiology course, where essentially this art is simply connected to the health conditions that we've been exploring in a much more bench science technical lens. And with permission from one of my students, I will share one of the reflections that I received this past summer when I integrated this assignment into this course. And so this student wrote in their reflection, and this is the image that they created. They said, I chose to reflect on the lived experience of my twin sister who passed away at the age of 19 after battling stage 4 osteosarcoma. My artistic creation is a drawing of my sister enclosed in a box surrounded by fast-growing cancer cells. There's no way out of the box, symbolizing how trapped she must have felt, confined not only physically by her illness, but emotionally by the knowledge that there was no cure. The red dot in the drawing represents the original location of her tumor, and the spreading cells, the cancer cells, show how quickly the disease overtook her life. The box also symbolizes the contradiction of the human body and chronic illness. The same system that is meant to keep her alive was now destroying itself from within. Creating this drawing allowed me to process some of the emotions I still carry from witnessing her experience. As a future nurse, this process reminded me that illness is not just a set of symptoms or a diagnosis, it is an all-encompassing disruption of someone's life, identity, and future. This experience, creating the artwork, has changed my nursing practice moving forward by grounding it in empathy and reminding me of the importance of being present, compassionate, and emotionally attuned to my patient's lived experience. And I wanted to share this assignment because traditionally, this is not the type of knowledge that students are evaluated on in a bench science course, but it also gave this student the opportunity to make sense of what they were learning in this work and how that would inform their practice in the future in a way that was also really healing for them.
Ashley,
I
you
know.
weren't able to see so many hearts when you were sharing her.
Yeah, I didn't see any of that.
I know.
Well, I will also say, like, I talked to Heather about this, but when I read these assignment, I can't believe I didn't cry actually reading that. This student shared her like images of her sister. And now I will cry, but whenever I read these assignments, they're just so beautiful. About half my class chooses to do them, and I would say half of that half all share these beautiful lived experiences of losses that they've had in their life and family and people that they love. And it's just so refreshing as a reminder that, we can easily forget in the clinical lens to say so focused on, the medication we need to be giving and be detached from that person's lived human experience. And so it's been a really beautiful assessment in terms of reconnecting students to people's personhoods. Anyways, okay, Heather, talk.
Am I
And
supposed to
this
talk
is
about
recorded.
libraries now? Folks, because that was more important than what I'm going to talk about, I will just, yeah, pause to acknowledge the thank yous in the chat and say that the other examples we have from this area will be the focus of webinar 3. So I might just skim over them quickly so that we can recognize and sit with the value of what we've just heard from Ashley, because we're trying to bring this lens also to how the library supports nursing and teaching research methods as well, and in acknowledging like the students' lived experience and telling them that they are knowledge holders, that their lived experience is the kind of knowledge we would like them to invite to bring into their research methods courses, to bring into pathophysiology, etc. Is that requires a shift in also how we think about research evidence and what kinds of sources are accepted in research methods, in your course assignments, in the kinds of citations that you're accepting from your students. So this is something we'll be talking about. Well, I'm saying I won't be here. My colleague Katie, who you met previously, she'll be rejoining and talking about how we talk about this in research methods and saying to them, you matter. And the look on their face, on your students' faces when we say to them that we value your knowledge is something that has shifted me in how I teach information literacy to your students. And so one thing that we talk about with them is both themselves as knowers in a variety of positions, as nurses, as researchers, as humans, But we also talk about it within the context of living in an information age and the amount of health-related mis and disinformation that exists and how they have a responsibility to navigate that for themselves, but also for the patients that they care for. And so next time, what you'll hear Katie talk about is a framework that we also use for teaching your students how to determine what knowledge they should use as evidence in their evidence-based practice. How can they, when we're talking about broadening, really expanding our definitions of knowledge to include story, include land-based knowledge, include spiritual knowledge, and all elements of your students' positionality and your own, being welcomed into nursing. We also have a responsibility of thinking about how do we determine what knowledge is true and where is there potential for harm. And so this is a framework that they'll be working through next week in relation to connecting all of these topics together. Shout out to chapter 5 of the resource we've been sharing.
Yeah.
That's where this is described in more detail if you want to get a peek at it in advance.
Okay. I think one thing that is always clear to me every time we have these conversations is that we can't do this alone. And more importantly, we should not do this alone. We should be doing this in relation with others. So let's talk about relationality a little bit. Next slide. Knowledge is relational with so many. It's relational between us. So me, my students, our communities, our patients, with the land, right? We learn from the land. We can learn from the land. And in the next webinar, you're going to have an opportunity to really expand that community's lens and think about patients and building knowledge with other communities as well. For today's webinar, since we're thinking about our courses, I thought we might expand on the lens of students as partners a little bit and think about to what extent is our curriculum something that happens to students, and how can we make it something that we do with students? So next slide. When I think about decolonial movements across the world, there are two that come to mind that have been particularly powerful in my eyes. And it's because of the way that they were student-led movements. And the first is the Rhodes Must Fall movement at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, where students protested the presence of a statue of Cecil Rhodes on their campus and articulated a really important question. Why is the statue of somebody who played a really, really big role in the colonization of that place, something that we see every single day and something that is on our campus? And that movement at the University of Cape Town in South Africa then also swept to Oxford University in the UK. So then there was a sort of parallel movement that took place there. The one in Cape Town happened around 2015. The one in the UK happened starting 2016, which then led to a second movement across the entire UK, which was, why is my curriculum white? That movement in particular started at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. It was student-based, and it was students asking the question, why is my curriculum white? Why am I learning what I'm learning? Why is what I'm learning have so little to do with who I am and what I want to be in the world? Who makes these choices about what I learn? And why do I have no say in what I learned? That movement I continue to return to because it was so powerful. So it started at the University of London and then swept across the entire UK. If you even just Google, why is my curriculum white? Examples will come up of student videos, student reflection questions, student position papers that were posted by students at universities across the UK, and they are really, really powerful. And we've left some videos in the slides that you can access after the session to hear these students ask these questions in their own words. I think we do such a disservice when we remove the curriculum from students because they have an important role to play. Next slide. So how can we make the curriculum something that we do with students, right? So how can we work with students to critique our syllabi with them, to learn from them about how they experience their syllabi? And that's something that we've done with certain programs at Western, where we've had students work with us to share with us what experiences they had in going through the curriculum and what changes they would like to see. So can we design our syllabi with students? We've had folks at Western who have undertaken a project like this. I can't lie to you and say that there's not a lot of institutional red tape that we need to get through when we do projects like this, but it is possible. And there's different ways that we can structure this for students to get their feedback. Next slide.
Some of the examples that I want to shout out quickly from my own perspective are nursing students. So as a librarian, I don't have my own classroom. I don't have my own students, and I have to be invited in. So as the library at Western has shifted towards a knowledge justice approach, in order to engage in students as partners work, I needed your students, and I can't begin to express the knowledge that I've gained from your students from nursing through this. And one way was at Western, we have the Master of Nursing Leadership and Professional Nursing Practice program, and their culminating course is a knowledge synthesis course where students can, take a placement in wherever. The number of students who are seeking Ashley out, and by proxy myself, to partner with exploring how knowledge justice applies to nursing, but also more broadly, has resulted in a lot of deep learning for me. And so the definitions you're seeing on our slides today of knowledge justice, the more plain language descriptions you might see in the book, the teaching cases that we're using both in the book as well as when I come to visit nursing, are based on these nursing students' knowledge. And something that they've really helped us to understand is that these concepts are really challenging to explain and to relate to our own experiences without cases. And so nursing students have identified examples of knowledge injustice that they are seeing in their nursing practice, turning it into a teaching case that then I am getting to use in my teaching of faculty, of colleagues like you in other programs. That has really helped me in understanding that that's essential for making this concept more real. And today we're hearing that from Ashley. Similarly, one of your students helped with the framework of harms and in helping us see, like, as students, they don't see the knowledge seeking that they're doing at the bedside, on social media with their friends and family, and for your academic assignments is necessarily different. And so we need to be talking about knowledge in all of these contexts at the same time and in one breath. And so it's something that I'll share for you to take away for your own home places and your own institutions, is students have been very eager and ready to do this work, to challenge sort of the foundational scholars, to challenge some of the more racist and inconsiderate knowledges and ideas that are at the center of all of our disciplines. They live this idea of Eurocentricity every day. They are seeing it. And so they've been much more able to jump into this work than perhaps me and some of my colleagues. And so if you want to engage in some of this work of interrogating your course outline, interrogating your discipline, your students are probably a place for you to stop talking and to listen, because it's something they live every day.
Okay, we will start to wrap it up and start making connections to the next webinar that we'll be going into in November. I want to pause for a moment and acknowledge critiques of decolonizing the curriculum, because I believe these critiques and I am always concerned about them and always have them in mind. And there's so many critiques there. This is not even a comprehensive list, right? There's questions around the sustainability of our movements and our efforts. Is this a fad? Is one way of asking that question. What is the intent Is this a fad? Might be another way of asking that question. Why are we doing this? Are we doing this because our institution has said that today this is important and tomorrow it might say we don't have money for this anymore and we're taking this away? One approach to this that I often hear is, can you give me a checklist of things that I can fix in my course? And unfortunately, we can't, because it's so much bigger than a checklist. And so much of this work is steeped in context and relationships. And so it will differ from course to course and individual to individual. There's no one right answer, or one way that we can all do this. One of the things that I struggle with immensely is the managerial impulses of the university in this case. And you could think of hospitals in the same way. The emphasis on numbers and metrics. Well, show me what change this is making, and show me what change this is making in numbers. Represent that change in numbers so that we can continue doing this. That's not what this is about. We may have leaders who have asked us to make swift changes, to do things quickly, get changes quickly. And then, of course, there's always, and this is a personal one, that's something that I'm always concerned about, reproducing harm in new ways. So we have good intentions when we engage in this work, but in leaving out certain voices sometimes, or there's lots of ways that we can replicate the exact harm that we're trying to undo. So what's guiding us? Next slide. So this is the paradox, right? Despite our good intentions, we can replicate the exact harm that we're seeking to dismantle. So what can we do, right? We can't do nothing. Next slide. That's where the ethical solidarity piece comes in. And what does that look like? Next slide. People always ask me, what should I call myself? Should I call myself an ally, an advocate, an activist? Like, where on the spectrum should I be? And my answer, there's criticisms of each of these terms. You know what? The term at the moment is not important to me. What is important to me, next slide, is that we're guided by informed action and ethical solidarity. So what is that? Next slide. It's the things that we've talked about. It's sitting with that discomfort and not taking action until we've gotten to know the problem. This is key, working in partnership with people rather than speaking for other groups of individuals. And it's experimenting and improvising. And when we do something in the curriculum that does not sit right, it's the willingness to go back, undo it, and redo it. Because as we've said all along in this webinar, this is a process of unlearning and relearning, and we're just figuring this out. One of the things that impacted me the most was I once had the privilege of hearing Murray Sinclair speak about reconciliation. And he said, this was about 5 years before he passed, and he said during that presentation that reconciliation will not happen in his lifetime. And I remember being heartbroken listening to him and hearing him say those words, because here was a man who I respect so tremendously and who had worked tirelessly and had devoted his entire life to the project of reconciliation. And to hear him say that it wouldn't be accomplished in his lifetime was gut-wrenching, but so true, right? And that was something that he knew, because he knew that this is a process, centuries in the making, that is going to take us time to undo. And that's the process that we're engaged in right now. So where are we going from here?
So we'll pause here, knowing there's some really important questions in the Q&A that we don't want to miss before we wrap up, but also knowing that we will have a chance to regather in a few days' time to continue this conversation. And next time, what we'll be considering is our focus of today has been on the course level and on our own teaching practice and its relationship to our students. And so in the next time we gather, but mostly in webinar 4, we'll be looking at what are the broader implications for our program, for our partnerships, for our research and policies and practice. So stay tuned, because we'll be building on the knowledge that we introduced in the first 2 parts in the next couple of parts of the series. So a reminder of those dates. And in a moment, we'll put our contact information on the screen so that if you want to get in touch with us in between webinars, to be honest, like me and Ashley and Aisha, we want to talk about this all the time. This is what we want to talk about all the time. And so we welcome your questions. But while we do that, there's a couple that are really big and heavy. One was in the chat and one was in the Q&A that I want just to acknowledge that they came in, but with that understanding of it might be beyond what we're able to answer today. So the first was from Amy in the chat who asked, was colonialism a fad? And Amy, that is a 500-year-old question. And even just this morning, I watched a TikTok of a fellow who said, some might argue colonialism was a success. That it was a goal of, like it was a financial and governmental purposeful decision by particularly, not like, I mean, colonialism has a history all over the place, but they were concentrating in that video on Western European countries. And some might argue that it was a success based on some of the values that we've been talking about today. But, and Aisha, I imagine you want to jump in on that one.
Yeah, I'm more worried that decolonization is going to be a fad, and that that folks who are saying that's important to them right now at the institutional level might change their minds on this. I think it's hard to see colonialism as a fad because it lasted for so long and is still ongoing, right? That there are concrete forms of colonialism still at play in the world that we are unable to recognize and call as such. Like we have a really hard time saying, oh, that's happening right there is an example of imperialism or colonialism. And so for that reason, I think no, because it's still happening.
Yeah. Yeah. The other question we had, we did answer a little bit in the Q&A, but I wanted to bring to the attention of the group, and the person in the Q&A asked about whether Freire, Paulo Freire, is influencing sort of like our decolonial approach. What I would say from my lens would be, we are exploring, like it's a yes and. And so at the beginning of today, I mentioned the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures collective's work, and Aisha has referenced their work as well as Mignolo and other folks. Positionality work, a lot of it comes from a critical lens of whom, like Paulo Freire belongs to that camp. What I would say, and Aisha, you can correct me if I'm wrong, at Western, what we've been trying to do is blend a critical lens, a Black feminist lens, an Indigenous lens, a decolonial lens, to consider our place within that. And that it's not Freire definitely has really important lessons from that guide us towards using a inclusive, like moving away from the banking model of education. But so too do Indigenous scholars, particularly whom we have responsibility to as settlers on their land, would be my answer to that question. Aisha, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I echo pieces of that. There's always scholars that are going to hit closer to home for you as you're working on something more than others. And I think for us, I go back to Freire a lot because he raised such important questions. And thank you for asking the question also, because I think it's probably time that I could return to Freire for some of those critiques of capitalism that I think I need to be engaging and making more explicit. But I think there were some other scholars that spoke to us a little bit more personally and deeply.
Well, I just added in the chat that even bell hooks for
I was
critical.
gonna say that exact same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
yes,
like,
Saeed Batiste, yeah.
yeah, yes, yeah, yeah, particularly.
Yeah,
You
I
can
think
check out the,
we have a lot to learn from many different scholars, yeah.
if you're new to this area, the article I referenced at the top.
Okay, bonus points to the person who just put Baba on the on the list. That just made me personally very happy. Also, just want to acknowledge Andrea's comment about student as teacher and teacher as student, just in terms of a model for working with students as partners. And yes, feedback.
Amy, do you want to teach the
Amy,
next
can we be
one?
friends?
Yeah. Okay, great. Oh, here's how you find us so that we can stay in touch. Yeah, precisely.
I think we all just saw how academics make friends.
Viva la resistance. Does anybody have any other questions about anything we chatted about? And yet again, we have somehow miraculously finished on time.
I don't know how.
I don't either.
I'm writing down Amy's email address. If you haven't had a chance, download today's chat because there's been such great resources shared by our colleagues in the chat that I definitely personally want to save. And thanks so much, Amy. I hope you're able to join us in the future. And if not, we'll connect offline. Keith, I see you. Are we wrapping up?
Yeah, if there are no more questions, I think we're good to wrap up then at this point. So I'd like to thank again, Ashley, Heather, and Aisha for presenting today. And thank you all for everyone that was able to join us today as well. Reminder to everyone that this will be recorded and posted on Kazan's YouTube channel in the near future. And we hope to see you all for part 3 as well. That will be on November 13th at the same time of 11 to 1 Eastern. And hope everyone has a great day.
Thanks so much for your help as always, Keith. And thanks to everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.